So now we really have a treat. So this will be our closing panel. I'm incredibly excited because we've been talking about hate crimes, we've been talking about civil rights, and we've been talking about political events of the last 6 months. And I think much of the conversation in this room and in the hallways and in the breakouts, let alone if you turn on the news, the television in your room or you look at your phone, is focusing on this issue of fake news and this issue of the credibility of information and this issue of what does it mean for our democracy? What does it mean for our country when our elections are being manipulated by trolls from other countries, when facts aren't exactly what they seem? And so now we're going to have a discussion, if you will, with two of the leading experts inside the Beltway who understand news and the media, its history and its present, and I think you're really going to enjoy the dialogue. So please allow me to introduce Jeffrey Herbst, the president and CEO of the Newseum and the Newseum Institute, as well as Eric Wemple, the media critic at the Washington Post. I think what I'd like to do is do brief introductions of both Jeffrey and Eric, and then I think it might be helpful actually just to set the stage to talk a little bit about what both of you do. I don't know if everyone knows what a media critic is, to be frank. I mean, we all feel like media critics to some degree, but maybe you could talk a little about that and talk a little bit about the Newseum as well. Sure. So why don't we start with Jeffrey. As I said, he's president and CEO of the Newseum, the Newseum Institute. From 2010 to 2015, he was the president of Colgate University. And prior to that, he served as provost and executive vice president of academic affairs and a professor of political science at Miami University in Ohio. And for 18 years prior to that, he taught at Princeton, where he also earned his bachelor's degree summa cum laude in 1983. And he also has a master's from Yale and a doctorate also from Yale. I'll also just quickly introduce Eric. He is, as I said, he's a media critic at the Post. He's been there for a number of years and analyzes both media coverage and those who make the news. And he covers a broad area of territory. So why don't we start with you, Eric, to talk a little bit about what it means to be a media critic, and then we can sort of get into the dialogue with Jeffrey as well.
Well, I work at the Washington Post. I work in the opinions part of the paper, so I'm licensed to basically say what I think about things. And lately there's been lots to think about and lots of opinions to express, especially in the media ever since Donald Trump began a couple years ago. Media criticism has, of course, been one of the few things on which he has been consistent. So there's been plenty to discuss there. But yes, it's my job basically consists of looking at the way the media covers any given event, how it basically affects the way people think about these things, and also constantly sort of judging the credibility and the integrity of media outlets. And that has also been a very busy pursuit lately, especially with everything that has been happening at Fox News, which is obviously a major media player.
And I think we'll talk about that.
Okay.
All right, Jeffrey, tell us a little bit about the Newseum, if you would.
Came to the Newseum in August of 2015. I thought at the time there were significant First Amendment issues. I had no idea what was going to happen. But the Newseum is the preeminent national institution that promotes, explains, and defends the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. Our building on Pennsylvania Avenue attracts about 800,000 visitors a year who explore galleries that talk about the evolution of freedom, challenges to free speech today. We bring together people of very different ideas, philosophies, to talk about challenges to liberty. And we have an online education program which reaches about 7 million school children in this country and 159 countries around the world. And we talk about democracy, elections, and more recently, we've released digital packages on media literacy, digital literacy, and focusing on fake news. I'd like to say personally, it's a real pleasure to be here. As a Jew, I support, of course, your activities fully, and I've been able to follow your recent activities, which I think are outstanding. And as an advocate of free speech, of course, I've thought hard about what the current climate means for not only Jews in America, but all the other communities that we are concerned about.
Great. Well, I want to build upon something you were just kind of talking about vis-a-vis your work in the Newseum. And as we talk about fake news and free speech, what is fake news? Is CNN fake news? Is Fox fake news? Like, can you help us to and the Washington Post, isn't that fake news? So help us understand what it is and what it isn't so we can make sense of what we're hearing.
Sure. I define in the current environment fake news as deliberately false information that's designed to be spread via social media platforms to influence a point of view and, quite critically, to make some money. And one of the things people don't talk enough about fake news is it's in good part a commercial activity. Mm-hmm. I'd also say that this is not a new issue. There's been incorrect information and often what we might say is fake news throughout our country's history, throughout most of history. So-called yellow journalism in the 1890s may have led us to war, Spanish-American War, and may have led to the assassination of President McKinley, and War of the Worlds by Orson Welles, and all kinds of other things. What's different in the current environment, of course, is that the media ecosystem, the information ecosystem is open. There are no barriers to entry, and things can spread, can go viral very quickly. CNN, Fox News, the Washington Post are not fake news. They may occasionally print contentious or incorrect information. I think responsible journalists have an obligation to correct that, which I think they do. But when I think we're talking about fake news, we're talking about something different.
I think I agree with the definition, and I would also add that the definition had a way of migrating last year. It was, as Jeffrey says, fake news has always existed. It sort of had a starring role in the 2016 presidential election as BuzzFeed and other outlets documented that there was this huge plume of phony reporting regarding Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and it seemed to have a bias of its own according to the statistical studies that were done. But when that came out, it was originally sort of posited, originally reported that the fake news plume helped Donald Trump. Then you found a lot of other people using the term and trying to attach it to other sorts of reportorial mistakes and bad stories and so on and so forth. So the term became politicized like everything else in our country, and it became pretty much useless in the course of, I don't know, maybe a day or a week. And it was used to describe, Jeffrey said, it is deliberately fabricated story. So already that disqualifies a lot of stories that turned out to have been wrong, but were written with good intentions or were published when people thought that they were getting the truth. I'll use an example. Fox News, which you, I think, correctly said is not fake news. I happen to think it's a terrible news outlet. I happen to think it's a corrupt news outlet. But I don't think that they print fake news or publish fake news. And I'll use an example. I think it was in January maybe or a couple months ago. It published a story that food stamp fraud was at an all-time high. It's turned out to be nonsense. Food stamp fraud was not at an all-time high. It happened to square with Fox News' worldview, which is, there are all these takers out there, and there are too many people who are not making it on their own. But it turned out they had some sort of lame source for this. They printed a correction. They did a correction on air. That's a big part of this, right? It's not fake news if you run a correction. That's where Jeffrey said it's deliberate. If you go back and you correct it, you're among the community of people who are at least trying, making some sort of effort to get it right. And I think that's what distinguishes, in large part, journalists from fake news purveyors.
It's interesting because it's almost like you're saying there's lazy news and then there's fake news, and maybe they're not the same.
I definitely think they're not. Pizzagate is fake news, right?
Can you just quickly what Pizzagate is for this room?
Pizzagate was the conspiracy that came up on the web. I forgot exactly what the start date was, but it posited that Comet Pizza, which is up on Connecticut Avenue, just a couple miles up this particular street, was running basically a child abuse ring, a child sexual abuse ring. And they had tunnels in the pizzeria, and people were, and this was a Democratic thing because the guy who ran Comet Pizza, whose name I don't think I'm even going to mention here, has a lot of Democratic connections. And the conspiracy theory was that this guy who runs this pizzeria is running a child sexual ring and is using that somehow to help Hillary Clinton. And it's just all this, it all tumbles from there. But, everybody, you see this in a lot of people on the web say, oh, that's garbage. Everybody recognizes that as garbage. But on December 5th, I believe it was, one of the people on the internet who put more faith in this than others came up to Comet Ping Pong with a gun. And he wanted to self-investigate the stories about Comet Ping Pong. He was arrested, and he eventually reached a plea deal, I believe, with the prosecutors. But this is like the sort of classic or the sort of like wake-up moment when we realize that the stuff that we put on the internet, fake news, the stuff that people think is fun, conspiracy theories and so on and so forth, can actually ruin people's lives. Luckily, no one was hurt.
Well, look, I mean, it's interesting to hear that, because when you talk about fake news driving conspiracy theories, I think many of us at the ADL would say that, the sacred text, the founding document of fake news is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which posited this conspiracy about the Jewish people,
Right.
which has been used to legitimize or rationalize, irrational persecution of the Jewish people across the ages, across geographies, to horrible outcomes. So we get it. But what's interesting, I think, what you said is you talked about this individual who wanted to self-investigate, which itself is sort of a curious thing. But it seems like in the age of social media, everybody feels like they're an expert. And social media seems to have, maybe there was this fake news before and it led to other kind of bad outcomes. And you mentioned yellow journalism and the role that it played in the Spanish-American War. But can you talk a little bit about the uniqueness and the impact of social media in feeding this frenzy? Or is it actually a solution or an antidote, if you will, to the misinformation?
Yes, I think is the answer.
Okay.
Look, what's happened briefly in social media is that we had gatekeepers to the news environment. Museum recently celebrated the centennial of Walter Cronkite's birth. He was the ultimate gatekeeper. He said that's the way it was, and for a significant number of Americans the next day, that was their common set of facts and what they knew about the world. And for a long time in this country, there were 3 television networks, a couple of newspapers that set the agenda and the common fact base for the United States. There were a lot of problems with that. Among them, that there was a couple of white guys in the Northeast who were driving that, and it wasn't very diverse, and it was very controlled. So that's all gone. Today, the Washington Post has a print circulation, digital much higher print circulation, a couple 100,000 a day. You can have a 17-year-old on YouTube with a following of 10 million, who paid nothing, by the way, for that following. So anyone can enter this information ecosystem, and we can access through these devices almost anything. To me, as both as a political scientist, as a citizen, as a free speech advocate, this is the golden age.
Yeah.
There's more speech than ever before. There's more speech in world history than ever before. That's overwhelmingly good, and the gatekeepers who filter a lot of information are gone. But the gatekeepers are gone. And a lot of things which were not, as they say, mentioned in polite company, or which were kept out, or which people may have had attitudes, but they didn't know if other people shared them, then they can find communities. Mao, during the revolution, wrote, a single spark can light a prairie fire. And what he meant by that was, people may not know what each other's attitudes were when they couldn't communicate. But suddenly there's a demonstration, in those days, a guerrilla attack, or these days, a tweet or a post, and some other people who say, oh, wow, I'm not alone. I have a community. Suddenly they can coalesce together. I'm not sure whether there's more or less hate-filled people out there than before. That's unknowable, I think. I do know they're much easier to communicate with each other than before, and much easier for them to get their message out. And that's just part of a world which we've just entered into. And this is kind of day one of the social media world. In 5 years, it'll be very different. We don't know how, but it'll be different. And I think we have to begin to think about strategies that take advantage of all this wonderful speech and to counter at the same time the fact that hatred can coalesce in the ways it could not before.
Yeah, I think social media, quite frankly, is terrifying. I deal with it all the time. And I will acknowledge that it scares the living daylights out of me. I mean, when I wrote something about Pizzagate, you know, there was this fellow down in Atlanta who runs these fact checks. His name is Ben Swan. And this was long after the Pizzagate thing had been debunked and debunked and debunked. And this guy gets on the air in, I think it was a CBS affiliate. It's not an owned and operated station. It was an affiliate station. And as to my recollection, he got on and he started trying to find the elements of truth in the Pizzagate thing. So he's like, oh, I don't remember exactly what his points are because they were so absurd, but it was on the level of, well, the pizza owner has the same middle initial as, you know, some other evil person, or, you know, stuff like this. Anyway, I wrote it up. I asked the station for a comment. I believe they ran away. I asked CBS for a comment. They wanted nothing to do with it. But I wrote up how absurd this was. And I got these Pizzagators coming at me on social media. Yeah. And, you know, they really know what they're doing. And, you know, they you know, you just start seeing the flood coming in. Yeah. And, you know, it is all just pixels, you know, but it's coming from somewhere. Right. And I've got to say, it does have an impact on me to see that. I try to monitor my social media. I think it's one of my responsibilities. But I think that, yes, that when people can infiltrate your feed, it has an impact. It has an unnerving, and it can move people to do things that they definitely otherwise would not do.
Yeah, I got to say, I sympathize. The stuff that comes at my feed at ADL is really kind of mind-bending. Right. I mean, you just can't imagine. And so it's interesting because I hear what you're saying, Jeffrey, that it is the greatest time for free speech. But I also find social media, and this is, I mean, I've worked in this field, you know, and it is really terrifying. And so I start to wonder, like, you know, what was it that Ben Franklin said? He said, they asked him, you know, do we have a monarch or a republic? He said, a republic if you can keep it. Not a pure democracy where everything was a referendum, but a republic where you have elected representatives who represent the 330 some odd million of us. So I guess I ask, you know, is it a good thing or a bad thing that you had a few people who were creating some editorial control and helping to develop a narrative? I mean, in some ways we think that's very bad. On the other hand, there was some degree of order and not Pizzagate being proven, if you will, with conspiracy and whatnot.
There was some degree of order, but the truth is there's no going back. I mean, there's no putting this genie back in the bottle. There's never going to be a journalist who has anything like the standing of Walter Cronkite to tell the American people this is the news agenda. So, you know, in some ways it becomes dare I say this as a former professor, merely academic to say, you know, what was the past? We're going to have to deal with a future that I think that is even more open in many ways. I think the trend is only going to be to fewer and fewer barriers of entry for people to enter the news and news ecosystem. And, you know, like the weather, there's good days and bad days, but you just have to deal with it.
But I'd like to make a little bit of an addendum to that point, and that is that I think there's a lot of noise out there, and I think that increasingly as we move along, people recognize the amount of noise and the amount of nonsense and the amount of garbage. I think that, you know, people are starting to migrate towards voices who are just above it all a little bit. I think that's in part what's behind all the subscriptions and all the increased prosperity for, say, the New York Times, including the Washington Post, outlets that people view as reliable and, you know, sort of enterprising in terms of getting to the truth of our very complicated times. So I think that there is, you know, all the noise and all the access and all the voices does create still a tremendous opportunity for legacy news.
It is interesting because it seems like, and, you know, we had Anna Navarro here last night who said many things, but one of the things that she said was that these criticisms of CNN are actually good for ratings. And she was more specific, said they're good for the bottom line. And I've heard this too, that subscriptions are up at the Post and that they're up at the New York Times.
Booming.
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 Yeah, and the stock prices of most of these companies have outperformed the market since the inauguration,
Right.
suggesting that the market has a pretty optimistic view of these media platforms.
So let's talk about markets then. You know, last summer we did this analysis about anti-Semitic abuse on Twitter, specifically targeting Jewish journalists. And I know you wrote about it, Eric. I think we talked about it at Aspen last summer. I want to ask, like, it seemed that Twitter only seemed to take notice of this issue when in their M&A, in the discussions around a potential acquisition, big firms like Disney and Salesforce pulled out and blamed the liability on the platform. The liability, excuse me, that they saw in the harassment on the platform. So, and at the same time, fake news drives a lot of clicks, right? So help us understand sort of the market economics of this, and is there a way to use that to disable the fake news? Or is, you know, if it bleeds, it leads? Are we in for a never-ending battle against this?
Right. Well, part of it, what you're seeing is the evolution, very quick evolution of the major platforms, Twitter, Facebook especially. Remember, these are very young companies, really weren't around 10 years ago. And if you had asked Facebook 5 years ago, are you going to be the major transmitter of news for millennials? They would have said, what are you talking about?
Right.
Because they're interested.
Baby pictures.
They're interested in you staying on site.
Right.
And if you watch a cat video or pictures of your nephew's baby or read an article from the Washington Post, it's all the same to Facebook. I mean, they've commodified news. So the DNA of these organizations was as pipes. We're just going to transmit as much information as possible. You stay on site, we'll make money from selling ads. But the problem is that news is different from baby pictures or cat videos. It has, as Eric said, ramifications for the world and for the people who show that news. And so if you look at just Mark Zuckerberg's evolution, you know, the day after the election, he said, fake news nonsense, you know, didn't happen, to today, devoting significant resources in thinking about it. These companies have evolved, but it's only been 6 or 8 months. And these are companies that are only 10 years old. So we're in the early days of this. I think at the end of the day, the platforms have a responsibility. We're starting to see them think about it. Also Google with search, you know, if you search about the Holocaust, should a denial site come up as the first hit? They're going through all these things. Some are technically difficult, some are philosophically difficult, but they're thinking about it. But I'll say in the previous era, and we had families that owned newspapers that thought for decades, including the Washington Post, about how their commercial interest aligned with the public interest. They agonized about it. It didn't always come out right. There were glorious moments like the Pentagon Papers. And so the Grahams thought about this for decades. Facebook's had been around for about a decade.
Right.
Been thinking about this for about 6 months. So that's not to excuse anything, but to put it in context.
So can I ask you a question about that, Eric? To be very specific. And we're going to take questions from the audience after this, so start thinking about what you want to ask. So the Chandlers and the Grahams and the Sulzbergers literally controlled the national conversation for generations, more or less. They set the tone. Does it concern you today that Zuckerberg and Page and Brin basically control a large portion of the ad dollars, a large portion of the searches today? Is it the same phenomenon or different?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I would say it is different. They are not news people first and foremost. They really aren't. They're technologists. They're, you know, they're interested in, you know, they look at, whereas the Grahams and the Chandlers and those great, you know, U.S. newspaper families, certainly they had kind of a monopoly in their day. You know, they had these
Very much
monopolies,
so.
but they judged their worth not only on these great monopoly, you know, revenues, but also on their scoops. And, you know, they were like feted by the local chamber of commerce. They were very much a part of one community. I think that, you know, you find the technologists these days, they feel themselves citizens of the world. But I would point one thing out, and that is that in the fake news analysis and the definition that Jeffrey offered, it's also one of the things about it was these people are and were making good money off of their ads that they got because they would create headlines. These are the best headline writers in the world, really. I wish we had some examples in front, but none come to mind. But it's basically Hillary has terminal, whatever. So that's what it was, and they would make up all these illnesses for her. And so they would do things like that. And off those headlines, they get clicks and they get Google ad dollars and so on and so forth. Google, and I believe Facebook as well, since has started to undertake measures to undercut their business model. In other words, to make it so that fake news does not pay. I think they have the right ideas, and in many instances, they have the right sort of goals. It's tough to make it happen, though. And you're right about Facebook, too. It definitely does not want to become an editorial judgment factory. It's a real spot. So anyway.
So maybe I'll ask one last question before we go to the audience. You're the experts, and I hear what you're saying if subscriptions are up, but the fact of the matter is the largest source of revenue for these newspapers historically has been the classified ads, and that has shrunk. So what do newspapers look like in this? And by the way, I can't help but look at the New York Times. The font is getting bigger. The pages are less. The printing is actually smaller. The journal looks, if you held a journal in a Wall Street Journal from the year, 1997, in 2017, it's like an entirely different
You
publication.
can fold it up and fit it in your pocket.
Totally. Right. So what do newspapers look like in 10 years? What's the health of the industry? What do you think it looks like?
I don't think there's a financial model yet for news production outside a few highly branded properties, Post, Times, Journal, that people will pay for. We just don't have the evidence yet that people are willing to pay for news production. By the way, news has always been a pretty lousy business. I mean, Benjamin Franklin established the post office in good part to subsidize newspapers, because even those days it was hard to make a dollar.
Is that right?
Absolutely.
And
There was a golden era between the 50s and Craigslist, where a booming population, advertisers had to reach people who had more dollars to spend. They could only reach them through newspapers. Ad revenue was up. But right now, most of the money in the ad space, especially mobile, is going to the people who distribute, especially Facebook and Google. They're getting the overwhelming amount of ads. So how you fund news, the people who hold our government accountable, report what's happening, I think is at the moment an unanswered question. Eric will have a more nuanced view on this. I don't think you'll see much print in 10 years.
But I think that you may be a little bit even too generous. I mean, the Washington Post, its owner is Jeff Bezos, and we used to get, before Jeff Bezos took over our paper in 2013, we used to get the quarterly reports because it was then a publicly owned company.
Right.
And those reports were depressing. Now, Bezos has done wonderful things with the Washington Post. He's invested in it. He's invested. They said last year they're now profitable, but what does that mean? Does that mean profitable every day? Does that mean, that he's getting back everything he sunk into it?
Right.
I don't know. The Wall Street Journal, it's struggling too. It's just done some layoffs and so on and so forth. So I agree with him. It is, newspapers have traditionally been the engine of news, not only on local but national. All these TV stations, all these TV outlets commonly get their scoops from the newspapers, and then they they go outside and they speak into a microphone. I mean, that's the way commonly it has been. And, Gannett has 109 newspapers around the country. They're struggling too. CJR just wrote a big profile of them saying, if Gannett's gone, if Gannett goes, what happens next?
And the fake news issue and the financial model of news issue are intimately related, because if there's less and less news from credible sources, inevitably, it's easier for the people who, with the attractive headline or with the seemingly sensationalist story, to get in there because there are fewer forces against them. And by the way, the same crisis is about to hit parts of cable news also. So the financial model challenges are not only even in print, they're also going to be on television.
By cable news, you mean CNN, Fox, MSNBC?